I'm Richard Moore. This is The Pathfinder, the podcast where we visit with faculty, administrators, policymakers, researchers, really anyone making a difference in the lives of students at community colleges. It's a partnership between the Texas Success Center and the Texas Community College Teachers Association. This week, we talk with Rex Peebles, Assistant Commissioner for Academic Quality and Workforce at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Prior to joining the coordinating board staff, Rex served as the Vice President of Instruction for Midland College. Before that, he spent 20 years at Austin Community College as Professor of Government, Head of the Government Department, and Dean of Social and Behavioral Sciences. He's a longtime TCCTA member. Rex used to chair the philosophy programs at our convention back in the day, and he's seen higher education from the inside out. In our conversation, we'll talk about his background, what the world looks like from his current perch, and the intersection between higher education policy and practice. With all the changes happening in our world these days, Rex has some important insights about what's coming and how people on campus can help steer the direction we take. We cover a lot of ground in our visit, and I appreciate the time he took to be with us. Let's get started. Rex Peebles, thanks for being with us today on the podcast.
Thank you.
So let's start out just talking a little bit about you. Where are you from? Where'd you grow up? What's your story?
Well, I'm originally from Dallas. Born there. Spent most of my early life there, but I actually went to high school in Georgia. So my dad got a job that took us to a little town outside of Atlanta. So I actually went to high school and graduated from high school in Georgia.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and then I went in the service and served in the Marine Corps, and then came back to Texas when I got out of the service and decided to go back to college. So.
Excellent. So where'd you go to school?
I started at Mountain View in Dallas, part of the Dallas County Community College District system, and then I went to UT Dallas and finished my senior years there. They were a upper division institution in those days, and just had become one, in fact. And so I was probably in the second or third year that they had started having juniors and seniors there. I got my bachelor's degree there.
And so, just out of curiosity, how long did that take you? I mean,
the bachelor's degree took 3.5 years.
Really?
Yeah.
So
I did that on the fast track. And then everything after that took longer and longer.
Still figuring it out, right?
Yeah. Well, that proverbial, what are you going to do when you grow up?
Right. So when you finished school, were you at ACC Next or anything intervening?
Well, in between that, I started a master's degree after I finished my bachelor's degree, but I did it part-time, and that actually took about 6 years altogether.
Okay.
And in that interval, I was self-employed twice, and I worked for, actually had partners, but me and a partner, we had two different businesses. And I worked for a manufacturer's rep for a while. And then I started teaching, while I was still working on my master's degree, I started teaching as an adjunct at Brookhaven College in Dallas.
Okay.
And that's where I decided that teaching was what I wanted to do. So I then applied to University of Texas at Austin and came down here to go to work on a doctoral program. And while I was working on it, I started teaching at Austin Community College part-time initially, and then eventually got a full-time job there, and then wound up staying at ACC for about 20 years.
Yeah.
Starting as an adjunct, and when I left, I was the Dean of Social and Behavioral Sciences.
That's where we met, actually.
And that's where we met when you were at,
You chaired our philosophy section at our
convention. For a long time, for a number of years. So
then after that, you went to Midland?
And then after that, I went to Midland. I was there about 8 years. I was Vice President of Instruction, Chief Academic Officer there. Okay. And then the opportunity came to go to work for the really dark side, the Texas, that when you shift from faculty to administration, you've gone to the dark side, and now I'm at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. So some people would view that as the really dark side of these things.
And what was the appeal there? What did you see when you heard about that?
Well, the reason I got into administration in the first place as a initially as a department chair and then a dean and then a vice president, was the chance or the opportunity to affect students at a broader level.
Mm-hmm.
And to see what you can do to try to move the needle on student success and completion and that kind of thing. And success in the sense of not just completing, but actually knowing something when you complete.
Yeah.
And really push that part of it. And also my background, all of my degrees are in political science.
Mm-hmm.
So while political philosophy is really my sort of my academic background, the public policy part of it also really appealed to me. And so the notion of having an opportunity to influence public policy was pretty interesting. So I applied for the job as the assistant commissioner for what's now called academic quality and workforce
Mm-hmm.
at the coordinating board, and got that job, and so here I am.
And so how many legislative sessions have you been through?
Two.
Okay. So you're starting to get the hang of it.
Well, I think, yeah, the first session was sort of the learning curve in a lot of ways. And then in this last session, I actually wound up participating quite a bit,
Mm-hmm.
both in terms of testifying to the higher ed committees, but also in terms of looking at a lot of legislation in the background,
Mm-hmm.
and working on some stuff, some bills, and then I think actually having some influence on them, hopefully good,
Mm-hmm.
in some of the outcomes of those bills. And so, and of course, as a political scientist, you know, the opportunity as a political scientist to see the sausage being made
Yeah.
up front, and it really is as ugly as they say it is sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes it's also interesting and also gratifying.
I think one of
Sometimes
the things I hear surprises a lot of people when they do get directly involved is that you tend to be dealing with really good people, and they tend to be pretty smart. You often disagree, but there just aren't a lot of evil people. It's just you disagree.
Yeah.
So, and often it's easy to kind of have a caricature of people in those roles. So.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely true. And I think one of the things you find out is that the vast majority, like you said, they're good people, and most of them are really also very smart
Mm-hmm.
as well. But I think they also mean well.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot of bad intentions going on there.
Right.
It almost always comes from some sense of we really want to try to help people in some way,
Mm-hmm.
and we do the right thing. And of course, as you point out, oftentimes there's a lot of disagreement about what that right thing to do is.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes there's a lot of agreement about it, and I think there's a lot of. It's kind of strange because politics these days is often characterized by this sort of uncivil discourse
Right.
that we have. But one of the things I found in working with the legislature, both with legislators and with legislative staff, is that there's often a lot of civil discourse going on there. There is a lot of give and take and really trying to understand the other person's position and really think about where they're coming from. And oftentimes you realize that they actually have something to contribute.
Yeah.
And you may too, but you get to that point where you think, well, okay, so they're not completely crazy or wrong, and they have a perspective that needs to be considered and thought about, and how do you try to accommodate that in a way that ends up in good results for everybody. So it's an interesting process.
And the importance of that just personal respect for one another, that really makes a big difference. You're that respect that I'm dealing with someone who isn't trying to break things, or really trying to do good. Then that's where the civil discourse can begin.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what you've come at this whole higher education project from a lot of different perspectives. What surprised you? I mean, when you got to the coordinating board, what were you not expecting? Was there something that you thought was going to be easy that wasn't, or something that you thought would be hard that turned out not to be? What was the?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I think on a personal level, it was difficult for me to make that transition to a regulatory body.
Mm-hmm.
And I often tell people that, I spent 8 years as a dean and I spent 8 years as a vice president. So I spent 16 years pretty much doing whatever I wanted to do in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fortunate enough to be given a lot of leeway and a lot of a lot of opening to create things, to not create things, to follow initiatives that I wanted to follow or not follow, as the case may be. And the level of, one could term it micromanagement, but it's not really that. At a regulatory agency is kind of different because everything you do or say has an impact. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it has a legal impact on folks. And so a lot of what you do and say then needs to be cleared up above you, that when you're at an institution, as an administrator, not a lot of that happens. It happens on the really important stuff, but people are given broad authority to do a lot of things. And so I think for me personally, that was sort of difficult to sort of get a hold of. On a professional level, I think what surprised me the most was how much, and it's interesting to me because as a political scientist, I've always known that self-interest runs the world, by and large. Mm-hmm. But it was interesting to find out just how much that's really true. And self-interest is defined in a lot of ways. I mean, it could be the self-interest of the institution as a whole. It could be the self-interest of a particular faculty member or administrator. Mm-hmm. And so self-interest covers a lot of ground. But it's interesting how much or how difficult it is sometimes to get people to sort of let go of the particular silo that they're in, whatever that might be, and think about what the greater good is. Mm-hmm. In a sense, and I guess I always thought that was just something that people did, but it's certainly not necessarily so. And it's one of those things I've sort of always known that it really wasn't true, but maybe I just didn't want to admit it to myself or something. But on a professional level, that's been very interesting to then have to try to find a different tact or a different way to work with institutions and work with folks.
Well, you've dealt with these issues as a faculty member and an administrator, different roles in administration, and now in this policy level. So you've seen change occur because you've changed seats along the way. But what kind of change have you seen over this time? Not just because you were changing your role, but what's different now from, let's say, when you were teaching adjunct at ACC or Mountain View?
Well, I think two things have changed, and I think a lot of times it's sort of wrapped up in this notion of the change from our focus on access to our focus on success. Mm-hmm. And particularly for community colleges, especially those that were created in the late 50s, 60s, early 70s, when a lot of them were created. Right. The focus then was on access. Let's get them in. But we still had that sort of sense of what one of my former presidents would always describe as the right to fail. Yes. And that is, so we get them in, and we teach them, and what happens to them, if they learn, they learn. If they don't learn, they don't learn. Mm-hmm. That's not really our responsibility. We gave them a shot. Yeah. We gave them the opportunity. And so I think that shift from, well, let's just give them an opportunity to let's also try to help them get through this. Mm-hmm. In all of the ways that comes through just paying some personal attention to students, to having tutoring labs, to supplemental instruction, to Khan's Academy, to whatever it might be. I think it's a real change. I think in the way that we approach education. And I think the other piece of this is, and I think we still have a long way to go on this front, but I think it's also, and it's sort of coupled together though, but that sense that if you're going to expand access, then you're no longer sort of skimming the people who are going to go to college and do well anyway. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Regardless of what the institution did, they were going to figure out a way to succeed anyhow. Yeah. And so they were just going to go through it and graduate, and everything was going to be fine. And I think for probably most of the country's life and probably most of the life of higher education in general, that's who went to higher education.
Yes.
By and large, it was the people who were going to make it regardless of whether they got help or not. But when we shifted to the focus on access and we started letting more and more people in, which has been a good thing, then we've also had to realize that, but not everybody is actually ready. And so I think one of the things that I've seen us struggle with, and it's interesting that we struggle with this whole notion of college readiness. So what does that mean? How do we define college readiness? And then how do we take a student who we have deemed to be not college ready, how do we get them college ready?
And we've kind of defined this in a way that creates that dilemma, because we've made it a both and. If we said, let's forget about the access thing, we did that, now we're going to do completion. Well, that would have been easy too. We're gonna restrict it to the people you could throw a library card and they'll be fine. And that wouldn't have been a problem. But as it is, we've got these two competing goals, and we're trying to resolve that tension. And that's where you have to deal with the question of college readiness, and not just say, if you're not ready, you can't come to college. If you're not ready, we need to figure that out too.
Yeah, and and coupled with that too is the notion that, we also know how we can, increase completions if we want to. If we just give everybody an A, then we're going to ramp up completions. We'll have everybody graduate.
I know that's a concern I hear a lot from faculty.
And the only people who won't graduate are the ones who, die or move out of state or simply just don't want to for some reason. So the other tension is created by how do you do all this while at the same time trying to maintain some sense of academic standards and rigor, so that a person graduates, they get a degree, it still means something, so that an employer or a graduate school can look at that degree and say, oh, okay, you've got a bachelor's degree and so from wherever, and this actually conveys something about the body of knowledge that you know and understand and what you can do with it.
Yes.
And that's difficult, and colleges struggle with that. It's a resource issue. I think we all know that there are hundreds of examples of where success has been achieved with students who were never supposed to be successful. But how do you scale up all of those things?
That's what. Yeah, well, I've been having conversations with people that are doing some amazing things, and scaling is often that's the bottleneck. We can do it for a few people, but it's hard to do for everybody.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So y'all have tried to take these aspirations and wrap some policy structures around it that can actually help us get there. And the current form that's taking writ large is 60 by 30. So could you talk a little bit about that? What is it for those who may not know, and then where are we in that?
So the Higher Education Coordinating Board is charged by law to create a higher education strategic plan. And somewhere along the line, the decision was made to make those 15 years in length. So we had the first 15-year plan was closing the gaps, and we're now in our second 15-year plan, which is 60 by 30, which denotes that by the year 2030, 60% of all Texans between the ages of 24 and 35 should have some kind of post-secondary credential. And that counts everything, certificates, associate degrees, bachelor's, master's, and doctorates. And that's the sort of the basis of that. Then the other goal is that Texas institutions themselves should be graduating about 550,000 students with some kind of degree in the year 2030.
To get us to those.
To get to those, to get to that other part. So those two are really intertwined with each other. To get to the 60%, we need the 550,000. Now the 60% will count students. If they're in Texas, it doesn't matter where they got the degree or the certificate. If they got one, then we count them.
They're part of the population. If they got their degree in Georgia, then that
in Georgia, then they count.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oklahoma, if they
got
it.
Well, even Oklahoma,
okay,
we'll count them as well. So we'll take anybody that's got a degree from at least an accredited institution. But those two are still tied together. And then the $550,000 is what Texas institutions are charged to do. Now we're currently at about 40% on that 60%. So we got about 20 more points to go between now and 2030.
Just for perspective, where does that put us nationally? If we're at 40% now,
A little below the national average.
And the 60% is that the 10 most populous states? Where do you come up with 60% as the goal?
We actually came up with the 60% primarily because of the Georgetown study, which was then followed by a bunch of others, that strongly suggested that by the year 2030, 65% of the workforce needed to have a post-secondary credential in order to maintain our standard of living as we know it today.
Mm-hmm.
And now one could then say, well, okay, then why didn't we choose 65%? Well, we also wanted to try to be ambitious but realistic at the same time. And since Texas was, at the time all this was started, was probably at about 37, 38%, 60% seemed to be an ambitious but yet realizable goal.
Okay.
Which is how we arrived at the 60% marker.
Okay.
And then to accompany that, based on what we know about how many people we get from out of state, then we sort of backed into the notion that you need about 550,000 coming from Texas institutions to achieve the 60%.
So what are the elements? I mean, you've got to break this down into a plan. It can't just be you point at the number 60 and say do that. You got to break it down into some elements. How do you? What are those elements? What are y'all seeing as crucial?
Well, so part of what we're looking at then is the whole idea of establishing some regional targets, and then within those regions, actually looking at and really hoping that the institutions do this themselves. That the institutions actually look at where they are, and where they're going to need to be in 2030 to realize that goal, in the context of their own region and in the context of the state. And so it doesn't necessarily ask every institution to, somehow reach the magical 60, but it does ask everybody to pick up the pace and move to where, and move at a higher level. And so it's a little bit complicated, but over the next few months, we'll be rolling out regional targets for this, and then consulting with groups within those regions about how do they then set institutional targets that can get the region there, that will get the state where we need to.
And you've built this quality question into this work. I mean, you're saying you want to make sure that the goals are happening and students are learning.
Yeah. Well, it's a really interesting thing that I've done a lot of presentations on the plan, the 60 by 30 plan. And after one of them, and I forget where I was at, a college in North Texas, and somebody in the audience came up to me and said, I've actually read the plan, and I didn't find the word quality in there anywhere. And so I went back and looked at the plan, and it doesn't talk about, and maybe this is a glaring error on our part, but I think to some extent we sort of assumed that those 550,000 credentials would be worth something. And I think if you look at the fourth goal of the plan, which is the marketable skills goal, this is where we actually tried to back ourselves into the quality argument in some ways. Because the marketable skills goal says that every program should identify marketable skills that students graduate with, whether it's a certificate, associate's degree, or whatever. And so the belief is that when a student graduates from college, they actually walk out with skills and knowledge they can take to an employer and say, you know what, this is what you need, this is what I can do, and so I can fit your need because I've learned how to do these things. I have these skills, I have this knowledge. But that's not always readily apparent. It oftentimes appears to be, and in programs that are really very much workforce oriented, and that would include everything from welding to accounting, or engineering degrees. I had a cardiac surgeon tell me one time years ago that what he did was just glorified Vogue Tech. You know, he said, I just take them apart and I put them back together and try to fix what's wrong with it. You know, and he, in a lot of ways, he thought of himself as a mechanic, which in many ways he is. The heart's a pump, like a lot of other pumps, and so it works by electricity, like a lot of other pumps do. And so there's this, you know, so for him, he sort of recognized the fact that so if he gets out of medical school and goes through a residency, then it's sort of apparent what he's supposed to be able to do.
Yes, yeah.
It's not necessarily that apparent for the social behavioral sciences and humanities.
But you see it in nursing programs, for example. There's a test,
yeah.
and we know how our students do. Yeah.
But it doesn't also convey the fact that nurse or that student or that engineer may also be able to critically think well. Yeah. That they may also be able to communicate well. Yeah. So there's the so-called soft skills. There's harder skills. I often tell people that, you know, when I was going through all my political science degrees, I actually learned how to do a fair amount of statistics. I couldn't do it now because I haven't used it in many, many years. But I learned a skill that in one of the jobs I had when I was working my way through college, I worked at a plastics plant for a while. We made trash bags. And, you know, later I realized that the statistics that I learned in a political science program easily qualified me to run the quality control department at that manufacturing plant.
Sure, yeah.
The techniques and the concepts are all the same. So I actually learned a marketable skill that I could have taken to a lot of places and utilized. Nobody told me that. You know, in the course of all these degrees, nobody ever said, hey, you know, all this statistical stuff applies to a lot of other things. Now, you know this, you sort of know this intuitively, but part of the marketable skills goal is to make this a conscious thing that students will have it on paper, so to speak, and be able to say, in addition to my political science degree or my accounting degree or my nursing degree, I also possess these other skills and knowledge that might be useful to you as an employer. And I think that also kind of carries with it a sense that those knowledge and skills are real, that they really can do that. And I think that's where the quality piece comes in, that we also have to be very aware all along the way that when we graduate that student and we count them as one of those 550,000, that student actually knows what they're doing.
Well, and that's I kind of noticed just anecdotally, which is not so that it's not data. It's just a bunch of conversations with people that there are a lot of different approaches colleges are taking to these initiatives, and the ones that seem the most heartening to me are the ones that are trying to identify the obstacles to student completion and addressing those. Often they have to do with counseling, advising, financial aid, those kinds of the means to the end of education. Not so much curriculum, although curriculum is certainly a part of it. But when they just make it about hitting a number, and they say you got to get your completion rates up, and they really don't look at what that's composed of, it doesn't take care of itself, and you can put faculty under a lot of pressure to do something in ways that they don't really have the means to resist. It's not that they should have done something different. They're not in a position really to
absolutely
to be the check on that.
Yeah.
Do y'all have conversations with people? How do you make that a part of your thinking, I guess?
Well, I think we've made it a part of our thinking in a couple of ways. And this occurs mostly, for us, it occurs mostly at the lower division level. But a couple of things with that. For most people at community colleges, they're either familiar with or they're connected to the academic course guide manual, whether they're familiar with it or not, because the courses they teach are in there by and large. For several years we run student learning outcomes projects with those courses to identify the student learning outcomes that should be associated with those courses. And then part of our hope is that then those outcomes will then be used for assessment purposes at the colleges. The core curriculum is one of those things where we've looked actively at both the core objectives, but also the subject matter content of the courses, and we'll be doing some more of that as we go forward in the future to try to ensure that there's some quality. And a lot of that's connected to the transfer issues, but it's also connected to this whole notion of are students actually getting something out of it, or are they actually learning, and do they exit that course with some knowledge? And it turns out that students actually learn more than we think they do, as a general rule, but how do we demonstrate that to the outside world has become much more important than we ever thought it was. I mean, part of higher education's problem, if you will, and challenge is that they've been insulated from the world for so long because they've always been allowed to do whatever they wanted to do, and without a whole lot of scrutiny from the outside. And then for years and years and years, whatever scrutiny came from the outside was always through the accrediting bodies, but really nowhere else. And now we're getting a lot of scrutiny from employers. We're getting a lot of scrutiny from government officials.
Well, and that's
to prove up what we're doing. So I think that's a piece of it.
And a lot of that's changed, I think, just because the whole expectation is when it is an access issue, just if you want to go to college, then you look at the people who come out of higher education with a degree, and American higher education has been the envy of the world. It was wildly successful under that model at achieving what we needed of it. But when you make it a ubiquitous education, that everybody needs to get this, to have a middle class life and to have the kind of economy we want to have, then it puts that system under pressures it wasn't under before.
Yeah, and I think another thing that we do at the agency, as a coordinating board agency, is that in our program approval processes and in our program reviews, one of the things that we've tried to pay more and more attention to is this going to result in a quality program? And we come at that through things like, do you have the appropriate faculty and the right kind of capacity and resources? So we sort of look at the elements that would make up a quality program, but we've tried to pay more and more attention to the issue of, we're not just going to put the program out there, but we're going to try to put a quality program out there as well.
Now, you mentioned transfer a minute ago. We're hearing a lot about this concept of guided pathways. I know the coordinating board is involved in that conversation, deeply involved in that conversation. What are you seeing there? How does that fit into the 60 by 30 agenda? What role do you see that in helping us get where we need to be?
Well, I think transfer is one of those things that has been, quite frankly, is always sort of at the tail end of the guided pathways project, because I think guided pathways, by and large, so far is focused on counseling and advising and getting them to fill out financial aid, all of which is terribly important.
Yes.
Don't get me wrong, but and I think part of the reason for that is most of those kind of issues you can take care of inside your own institution. You want to do something about transfer, you got to go talk to somebody else. And part of the problem in Texas is you got to talk to many people about it.
Yes. Yeah, that's one thing I think they found early. This isn't a statewide solution, at least not at this point. It's
well, I think there is, and we're working on one, in fact. And I think that, so transfer is something that we've tackled through two major mechanisms. One is core curriculum, and it was originally conceived of in the late 1990s as a transfer vehicle. I think in a lot of ways it's kind of gotten away from that, frankly, but it's something that we're going to try to bring it back and put a little more focus on the fact that these courses not only should transfer, but they should apply.
Yes.
And and the real issue is not transfer. As one of my, I served on the undergraduate education advisory committee at the coordinating board for a number of years, and co-chaired for a while. And my other co-chair one time remarked that everything transfers, but not everything applies.
Right.
And it was that remark that really got me to really start thinking about this whole issue of transfer, which a lot of people had not done. Most community colleges had never really thought about it. I mean, in any real serious way. It's like, well, you take all these courses, and they'll all transfer, so it's fine. And the 4-year schools are saying, oh yeah, we take it all and transfer. no big deal. And what nobody ever talked about, so is how much of this, if any, is actually going to apply to the degree I want? And I think that's the piece. One of the things that has changed dramatically is that we've begun a lot of conversations about what applies. And so we're going to do some work with core curriculum through that. But I think the field of study, which have been in statute for many, many years, but has never been very much utilized. 14 years ago now, 12, 13 years ago now, the coordinating board was instructed to develop 10 fields of study. And so they did, and then that was it.
Yeah.
And what we've done since I've been there is we've resurrected the whole notion of fields of study. And we board in July, passed 4 of them. So we now have 5 fields of study that have either new or been revised. We have probably 8 to 10 planned for this next year. And the fields of study are the block of lower division courses that will not only transfer, but they will also be applied to a degree. So if you take those courses, regardless of where you take them, if it's at a state institution, you transfer to another state institution, they must be applied to that degree.
Based on your experience on that committee and now where you are now, what makes that hard? I mean, why don't you just get a committee together and say, okay, let's do it?
Well, I
think I know the answer,
Yeah.
but
it's hard because you have human beings involved. Is the sort of the simple answer. But when I was asked at the Senate Finance Committee last year, and this is the sort of the conversation that really started in a lot of ways my heavy involvement with the legislative session this last round, the last session, was I was testifying to the Senate Finance Committee about fields of study because we had asked for some extra money to facilitate doing these things. And so and you might have been there, I can't remember, but anyway, so somebody on the committee, and I can't remember now exactly who it was that asked me this, but somebody said, so we've been working on transfer for 20 years. Why hasn't this been solved yet? And what are you going to do to fix the problem? And I was asked, why is this such a problem? And my response to them was, well, basically it's because you have 77 institutions in Texas, 50 community colleges, and 37 four-year institutions, all of which are very used to doing whatever they want to do. And it's true.
yes.
And I said, and you have no statewide system. In fact, we have 66 in this state. I said, so you have the coordinating board is the only thing that comes close to a statewide system, and it's not a statewide system.
Right.
And I said, so everybody does their own thing. And as a result, then you get 77 different approaches to name whatever major you want to. And even within the systems, we don't act as systems.
That's right.
You can take the A&M system or the UT system. No 2 schools within either one of those systems have the same degree plan. So, and in the day and age when people tended to start at a place and end at the same place, none of this was a big problem.
Right.
But we no longer have that. 75% of students who that graduate from a 4-year institution have hours from a community college. 35% of them have more than 30 hours, or I think that's the right number, or whatever that number is. More students, as a general rule, go to community colleges that are enrolled at 4-year institutions. Everybody starts there. Part of it's convenient, it's cheap. It makes a lot of sense for a lot of people to do this. 4-year institutions have a lot of capacity problems on the other end. They've got to make sure they can take care of juniors and seniors and graduate students. And so, so to try to create some seamless system is very difficult. And I really think, and if you listen to people on a field of study committee, most of their arguments and their resistance to this generally boils down to, well, this is not how we do it. They rarely ever actually argue about the subject matter of the discipline. They can actually pretty easily agree that all engineering students need to know these things. All civil engineering students need to know these things. But what they get hung up on is that at my institution it's taught in course A, and at some other institution it's taught in course B, and at some other institution it's taught in course C, And in some places it's a freshman course, in others it's a sophomore course.
So where does this get
No.
solved? I mean, is this something where you need faculty to sit down and
So
come to an agreement? Or?
the Fields of Study Committee are dominated by faculty members in that discipline.
Because what I'm seeing a lot of is that it's happening on a more regional basis, that community colleges are talking with the universities that receive most of their students, and they're finding out what do they require, and then there's some talking back and forth, and they work it out. But it's regional. It's not because we work with these 5 universities, and this other community college works with 5 or 6 or 7 others, and so that it's worked out that way. Is that sort of an interim step toward what you're talking about?
It's I don't know that I would describe it as an interim step. I think to some degree it's a stopgap. But and I'm not sure it's a very good stopgap, because those things change. They change without people knowing they change. I've worked on articulation agreements as a department chair, a dean, and a vice president, and they're long and they're hard. Sometimes they're very difficult to do. About the time you get them set, then somebody decides they need to change a course somewhere. The fields of study actually result in what is, in essence, a statewide articulation agreement over these courses. So I think articulation agreements are good as far as they go.
Is it doable, do you think?
The fields of study?
Can it be done at a state level?
Yeah, well, we've done 5 of them. So, yes, we know it can be done because we've done it.
All right.
It will require the 2-year schools to use them. And frankly, the community colleges can be just as bad as the 4-year institutions about, well, this is how we do it, and we don't care how somebody else does it. We want to do it our way. And I get that. I've been a faculty member before. I understand all this. And so it can be done. The 2-year schools are going to have to utilize them. The 4-year schools are going to have to understand that they have to take them. So there'll be some learning curve with this. But I had a faculty member on one of the fields of study committees who was really, he was ornery through the whole thing and obstinate about it. But at the end of it, he basically, when it was all over with, his comment was, well, okay, we'll do what we have to do. And so it's like, okay, I'm gonna fight every battle, but when the war is over, then I'm gonna accept the results of the war. And that's what you need. And I think it's interesting that when you watch the field of study committees, they are faculty in the discipline or administrators from that discipline. They understand the subject matter of their discipline, and usually they come together. It might take a couple of 3 or 4 meetings to do it.
Yes.
But they come together, and in the end, they almost always reach some consensus about how all this should work.
That's my experience with those has been largely that they start out with a lot of wariness and where you coming from and don't get on my turf. But by the end, there seems to be some respect and some trust that comes out of it, and they say, okay, we can work on this together.
And you'll still have people who don't like the idea and still don't want to do it, but you're not going to win over everybody, but you got to, so if you can win over the majority. And I will say that, we asked for this extra money for fields of study. My division is probably one of the few places in the state that actually got extra money this year. And so we got some money to hire another staff member to facilitate the fields of study. So we're going to go forward with that. And again, I think if the community colleges utilize them the way they should, and the 4-year schools, then and by statute, they're required to accept them. So if they don't, somebody just needs to tell us. We'll remind them that they do and work that out. But most of these institutions, if you just tell them, look, you got to do this, then they'll go, oh, okay, and then they do it. It's not as though people are they're consciously trying to subvert the law or do something that's not good for students. Most of the time, they just don't know. And once you explain it to them, it's like, oh, well, okay. Well,
So what's your advice to faculty and administrators at these schools? I mean, it's my sense that the sooner they get involved in the process, the happier they're going to be with the outcome.
Yeah.
Is that
what
you see?
And the fields of study are something that by statute they are, they fall under the Open Meetings Act and all that kind of stuff. So they're always publicly broadcast. We have to send out nominations for committee members. So I would encourage faculty to watch this. We're going to develop well, it's sort of already there, but we're gonna try to do a better job. Now, if you've ever gone onto the coordinating board's website, then you know that it leaves a lot to be desired. Hell, half the time I can't find anything on there. But we're going to try to make this a little bit more visible about what fields of study that have been done, what fields of study are in progress. And so faculty and administrators need to look for these nominations coming out and send people to them. And over time, we're going to be tapping the institutions a lot for the expertise. But the more involvement there is, the more people we have at the table, the better it works for everybody. And these things are decided by the faculty at that committee. You know, we don't, you know, I don't know anything about civil engineering. I don't even know enough about civil engineering to be dangerous. And so, you know, it's civil engineers that need to figure this out. It's social workers that need to figure out what courses the students need to take.
Stick around for more of our interview with Rex Peebles. But first, let's find out about some upcoming events for our community college folks in Texas. On November 6th, 7th, and 8th, the Success Center will be hosting its third annual Pathways Institute in San Antonio. This program will give people at colleges that are implementing guided pathways an opportunity to work with their teams in focused programs, as well as connect with colleagues across the state and hear from researchers in the field. You can find out more on the TAC website at tacc.org. And be sure to make your plans to attend this year's TCCTA convention up in Dallas. This is the largest gathering of community college folks in Texas, and there will be lots of programs covering more than 50 disciplines, as well as teaching hacks and time to meet up with your friends across the state who share your passion for teaching. Visit tccta.org for all the program and travel information. Now let's get back to the conversation. So let me add a layer to all this with pathways and transfer and articulation and transcripts with all kinds of institutions on it. Dual credit has exploded into just almost an unrecognizable phenomenon. What's happening with that? Where does the coordinating board get involved in dual credit issues, and what are you seeing?
Well, you know, dual credit is one of those things where the coordinating board has some rulemaking authority in terms of establishing things like college readiness and whether then you can take dual credit courses or not. Some of this is defined by statute, but some of it is defined by rule. There's one of the pieces of legislation that was passed in this last session calls for what it did was it confined dual credit to core courses, foreign language courses, CTE courses. Now this has always been it's actually always been in rule for community colleges. It now applies to everybody that offers dual credit, regardless of whether they're 2-year or 4-year. And it also makes it clear that if you go outside of that, there's no funding available for it either. So it really restricts what colleges can do. The caveats are that you can go beyond that if you have an early college, high school, or if you have a program that leads to an associate's degree. So there'll be some, we had just had a meeting today about the negotiated rulemaking committee that will come together to figure out what that means. That'll be some contentious. I think an even more interesting piece of legislation is the one that passed that calls for the coordinating board in consultation with TEA to develop goals and objectives for dual credit. And I don't think a lot of people realize, if you will, just how much power there is in defining what the goals and objectives of dual credit, or anything else is for that matter.
Yes.
And I think that's one of those things that's going to take us a while, and we're going to need a lot of, and we're going to need and seek a lot of input from the field on defining what these goals and objectives are.
Well, and the legislature gave us a little time. This last session, I think there was a strong appetite to do something, and they recognized we need a little time to kind of sort through this, figure out what's the right way to do it, so we don't make a mess we then have to clean up. But we're going to be going into 2019 with an expectation that we move on a lot of this.
Yeah, and there's a lot of issues around dual credit that remain to be resolved. I mean, I think dual credit's always been real interesting to me because, and I sometimes put it to people this way. I say, so, now we can, dual credit is wide open down to and including ninth graders. Mm-hmm. And so I always put it this way. I say, so if we really believe that a ninth grader is ready to go to college, because if we're going to put them in a college course, then on some level we have to believe they're ready to go to college. Then we've either done something really remarkable in K through 8 education, mm-hmm. or we've done something really unremarkable in college education. Mm-hmm. I'm not convinced we've done something remarkable in K through 8. Mm-hmm. I'm not convinced we've actually done something unremarkable in college education, but I think there's a lot of fear that we may be headed that way. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some sense in really trying to figure out who's really ready for college or not. And part of what we haven't thought through very well is the notion that while you may be ready to take a college course, that doesn't necessarily mean you're ready to go to college. So we have a lot of people coming out of high school that are 17, maybe 18 years old. They're going to go be juniors in college, and they're going to experience the freshman slump as juniors, which is something they may not be able to recover from. If you blow your freshman year or you blow a semester of it, you still got 3.5 years to recover mm-hmm. and get a good GPA and be able to go to law school or graduate school or get a good job. You do this as a junior, you may do irreparable harm to yourself over longer. So there's a lot of social, and one of the things, all of our college readiness measures are designed to look at intellectual ability. Yeah. None of them are designed to look at social, psychological yes, and whether you're ready for it. And so I think part of what we need to sort of parse out is really how does this work, and who's ready and who's not. And that goes. And the other thing I think it calls into a real question is so what do we need high school for? If we're going to send everybody to college in high school, then why do we need high school? Let's just send them to college. So the early college high school would become what do we need a junior or senior year for? I mean, why don't we just save ourselves an awful lot of money? But this raises, I guess, two questions. One is how soon they start dual credit if they start in ninth grade, and then the second is how many dual credits are they acquiring, so that they would start as a junior. We've got a dual credit practitioners group that a lot mm-hmm. of our folks that are in dual credit, and we've been trying to get feedback, really interesting conversations with them. And I've asked them, what do you think about ninth graders taking dual credit? And gotten some really candid responses. One of the things, we did a survey once, we were in a room, had about 100 people, and we just asked, and kind of voting with your feet type exercise. And I said, how many think ninth graders should not take dual credit, just categorically, and how many would say you just can't get enough ninth grader? Kind of on the spectrum, where do you fall? Almost no one said ninth graders should not take it categorically. That yes, they've mm-hmm. seen those remarkable young students, and they're ready for it, and they're going to be fine. But it is vanishingly small population that we're talking about here. Yeah. And so that they wouldn't say let's rule it out, but boy, we need to be very careful because of what you're saying. Long term, they're going to be juniors, and what kind of situations we put them in. But often they're just as a ninth grader. They'll be fine next year or the following year, but let them be a ninth grader. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, how fast do we expect people to grow up, or do we want them to grow up, mm-hmm. and that kind of thing. And when we see the college readiness of graduating high school seniors, how many were that ready a year before that, or 2 or 3 years before that? Yeah, and I mean, and I think, on some level, the commissioner talks about this a lot, about, and he's well aware of it. There are a lot of folks in high school who are ready to take a college course. There's no doubt about that. My daughters did it, and it was a wonderful experience. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, that are ready to do it, but what percentage is that? Mm-hmm. And the growth that we've seen, and I mean, as you pointed out, we've seen this exponential growth in dual credit since we opened it up to ninth graders. And in spite of the fact that everybody tells me that, that they don't let ninth graders into dual credit, almost all of that growth has come in ninth and 10th graders. Now part of that is early college, high school to some extent, and I recognize that. But a lot of it is just sort of opening the doors. And I think there is a real question that needs to be sorted out about how many, as you pointed out, but how many of them are really ready for this? And again, and I think it also calls into question in this whole point of, so what exactly is the value of high school then? If you can in essence skip high school and go straight to college, and a lot of people can do that. That they're not everybody's a Doogie Howser, but everybody can do that. Then that calls into question, well, then what is, there is no, never mind the value of college. What's the value of high school then? Outside of, Friday nights.
Yeah. Well, I know there's the UT system is very interested in this question of is there a sweet spot in the number of dual credit hours a student accumulates that it really is helping them, and statistically they're more likely to complete college, but it is how many is too many credit hours they acquire that way. I don't know that we have an answer to that yet, but there's a lot we're finding out as we go along.
Yeah, and we have a study that's trying to look at some of that too.
Talk about that a little. What are you finding with that?
So the dual credit study that we've done so far was mostly qualitative, and really in terms of looking at how dual credit students are advised, what kind of information are they getting, that kind of thing. And the next phase of it will really be the quantitative part of it, where we really try to look at this issue of success in later courses. How do they do once they go, once they leave high school and then go to college? How do they perform? How well do they do? But also this whole notion of were they college ready and that kind of thing. And so that part of it's just now getting underway. So we don't really know. But part of it is to try to look at this notion of that sweet spot. And one of the things we do know when we ran some analysis of for transfer at the request of the Senate this last time around, we looked at graduates who had who transferred. We looked at graduates with people with a bachelor's degree, and who transferred from a 2-year to a 4-year school, and we took out all of their D's, F's, and W's, and just courses that they got an A, B, or C in. So a student that started at a 4-year and ended at a 4-year, primarily started and ended at the same place, the average number of semester credit hours they lost was actually a -1, because some of them were bringing in AP credit and that kind of thing.
Right.
But but from a 2-year to a 4-year, they were losing on average 15 hours. Full semester's worth of credit was being lost to them. Now the interesting thing is, the transfer from a 4-year to a 4-year, though, on average they were losing 16 hours. Because traditionally, all of our transfer issues in Texas have always been talked about in terms of going from a 2 to a 4-year school. Yeah. Well, and I think what this points out is that since everybody's doing what they want to do, then the student's no better off transferring from a 4-year to a 4-year. And actually, they're a little bit worse off even.
Yeah.
So that's just as difficult as any. So it's a problem for everybody. But when we looked at students who had dual credit hours, that number went up to 21 hours they were losing.
Right.
And so part of it is that issue of how do you advise them, and how do you get to this point where we stop telling them just take all these dual credit hours because it'll be good for you, and we really get down to the point of, okay, so what is it you think you want to do? Well, in that case, these are the dual credit hours that will be a benefit to you, and it's these 18, 24, 36, whatever it is, hours that you'll be able to do something with later. That's what you should take as dual credit. Leave the rest of it alone, kind of
Do
thing.
you see any issue with a student, if they're starting dual credit in 9th grade, that we are putting them on a track? You're going to rack up a bunch of CTE dual credit hours or academic transfer dual credit hours. You might be able to do a little bit of that, but by the time they graduate from high school, they're so far down the track in terms of hours accumulated that it's hard I mean, where does the idea of an exploratory major go at
Yeah.
that point?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I think part of what we've done with, I think part of what we've done with high school is that for a long time, high school served some of that purpose.
Yeah.
Because it really exposed you to a broad
Mm-hmm.
set of stuff. I think things like the core curriculum can be used to do that as well if you use it properly.
Mm-hmm.
But more and more we just try to make it about courses that faculty want to teach and major specific stuff. And so I think we've lost a lot of that. Some people blame the 120-hour rule on this, that, well, we can't have any more electives. Well, you actually can if you really, if you really do your major the way you should, then you can. And so I think somehow we need to get some of that back, because I think it's another danger is you get so locked into this that it's the student who in their last semester of college decides, I really don't want to be a teacher after all.
Yeah.
Well, they've got so much time invested. They usually go ahead and graduate. They go ahead and get certified to teach.
Mm-hmm.
Then they go off somewhere to teach, and within a week they're trying to find another job, and that's why so many of them leave between 3 and 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is that investment. And if you tie up a high school kid this way, and I worry about some of that, and I worry about what this does to high school curriculum. I worry about what it does to college curriculum by taking out what they could have gotten in high school as a basis. So I give you one quick sort of anecdote about this. Years ago, when we first got into the institutional effectiveness movement and trying to figure out whether students were learning anything or not, so we did it. I was in the government department, and we did pre and post tests. And that was our initial stab at all of this, right? And it turned out that the scores on the pre-test and the post-test were virtually identical to each other. But it turns out they were high.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that tell you? Well, what that tells you is that these kids are coming into class knowing a whole lot more than we thought they did. Because we were assuming that they knew nothing about government, U.S. government in particular. And the reality is they were actually learning something in high school. And once we figured this out, we got to turn our whole curriculum up.
Interesting.
I got to say, man, I don't have to worry about trying to teach what these kids the 3 branches of government are.
Mm-hmm.
I can assume they know this and move on. Dual credit, I can't do that any longer because I'm teaching the high school class at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we're losing some of that knowledge base that's gained in high school that feeds into college. And so what does that do to the college curriculum then? And sometimes it's probably okay to lose that, but there may be other places where we don't need to lose that and shouldn't.
You're really raising a question I hadn't really explored or thought of, the kind of making the case for high school, why we need high school, because there's something substantial, just emotionally and developmentally, but also discipline-specific content that there's value there that we could lose something unintentionally if we're not careful.
Yeah, if we're not careful about this.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think some students are sort of capable of absorbing all of that at one time,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think a lot of them are.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody who teaches, and this is true of college classes too, nobody wants to flunk everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So you teach to the middle, whatever it is. And if you lower the middle, your standards are going to get lowered unintentionally. No one's going to try to do this. No one's going to set out to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But it could happen. And I think it's the thing we need to be very, very conscious of and very careful about.
We were very interested the last couple of years, especially about what people call systems thinking. A guy named Peter Sengi's done a lot of work in this, and he talks about how you have these situations where there's an outcome that no one wants. Everything from an unhappy family to a business that isn't getting what it wants, and nobody feels like they can figure out why do we keep winding up here, and it's because of the system. And you've got to be very careful what you build, because that's going to determine largely what you wind up with.
Your process does determine outcome quite often.
So thinking about, well, we didn't mean that ahead of time. can spare.
Yeah. Unintended consequences are everywhere.
And we need to know they're coming because it's so easy to get them. And that's where I think the legislature was very wise this last session to say, let's let this bake for a couple of years and come back with what you find out.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Careful.
I think it was really wise on their part to say we're not gonna mess with this much and just let it sit and let's study it and try to figure out where we're going and where we need to be.
So what did happen from your point of view? What happened in the legislative session, kind of the top line results of the session and any activity that affected us in the special?
Well, I think that talk about unintended consequences. I mean, out of this whole Senate finance conversation about transfer came some really interesting legislation from the Senate that was unanimously passed out of the Senate Higher Education Committee and was actually went through the consent calendar in the Senate and then died in the House of Representatives. But I think it had some interesting take on how transfer should be looked at, and it really made that switch from transfer to applicability. And how do we try to craft some public policy that's going to create more of a statewide solution to this that can reach a lot of people.
So talk about that just a minute. What did the bill contain?
So the bill would have actually strengthened the core curriculum in the sense that it would have made it a much more of a, for lack of a better way to put it, sort of transfer friendly.